Good evening. On behalf of St. Sebastian School, I would like to welcome you to the second installment of our faculty Zoom seminars, The Speech at the Stone, Childhood Memory, and the Moral Life. Tonight, we will be hosted by the chair of our English department, Mr. Chris Lynch. My name is Mike Melly, and I am the director of alumni programs at St. Sebastian's. In that role, I have the opportunity to meet with alumni across many generations. Anytime I meet with graduates from the last 20 years, the name Chris Lynch comes up regularly as a teacher who made a difference in so many lives. His students tell me that he has a unique ability to draw the young men of St. Sebastian's into thought-provoking discussions while letting them draw their own insights and conclusions from the classic works discussed in his AP literature class. I have also heard that he often welcomes a cup of coffee or tea in his classroom to get the conversation and creative juices flowing. In terms of logistics tonight, I will ask for your patience regarding our technical production. By the time this series is over, we should probably have it worked out. For those of you who are new to Zoom and are now looking at the sea of faces on your screen, just hit the button in the upper right corner of your screen that says Speaker View. Now you should be seeing me, but more importantly, you will be seeing Chris shortly. One of the hallmarks of Mr. Lynch's classroom is participation from his students, and we encourage you to share your thoughts this evening at the end of his prepared remarks. Chris Lynch earned his Bachelor of Arts from the College of the Holy Cross, his Master's of Education from Boston College, and a Master's of Arts from Middlebury College. St. Sebastian's has been honored to have Chris on the faculty and in the coaching ranks since 1997. He now serves as the chair of the English department and director of summer workshops. Chris lives in Franklin with his wife and 3 children. I encourage you to grab that cup of coffee or tea, and without further ado, I present to you Chris Lynch, The Speech at the Stone, Childhood Memory, and the Moral Life.
I hope that tonight we can enjoy a little time together talking about one of the great sources of comfort in any well-lived life. I am speaking, of course, about Russian literature. I want to thank Mike Melly for giving me this opportunity and for all of his work in making it happen. I can assure you it's not lost on the teaching faculty that we have so many awesome people advancing the mission of St. Sebastian School every day. When Mike asked me to speak tonight, I considered a few topics, but I kept coming back to one: The Speech at the Stone, from the ending of Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. The passage occupies a measly 2 pages in an 800-page novel, but it has, for a long time, been important to me. I hope that tonight I can help you understand why that's the case. There's some other whys we need to address first. Why Dostoevsky? For one thing, he's got a lousy head of hair, by Russian standards, a pretty wimpy beard. He was a gambling addict. He battled epilepsy his entire life, and in his younger years, he was exiled to Siberia for his loose association with an anti-Tsarist group. At first blush, he certainly does not seem like the type of guy you want to spend a Tuesday night in May with. Well, as I've said to my students to whom I've taught Dostoevsky's works over the last 20 years, we can be sure of one thing: this guy does not mess around. His works are not about the mundane issues of day-to-day life, or even thrilling but superficial concerns that occupy great romantic novels. To give my students some sense for the difference between a Dostoevsky novel and other great works they've read, I bring up the wonderful scene from Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, in which Daisy Buchanan weeps as she examines Jay Gatsby's pile of elegant and expensive shirts. It's a novel and a scene I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's touching, it's beautifully written, it's memorable. There's the wealthy and beautiful Daisy Buchanan meeting her long-lost love for the first time in 5 years. As Gatsby tosses the expensive shirts onto the bed, Daisy weeps at their beauty, and at this reunion she never could have anticipated. Now, for fun, why don't we try looking at the same scene through Dostoevsky's eyes? It certainly doesn't take place in a gorgeous Long Island mansion. Nope. It's probably set in a smoky, crowded, dirty apartment in which some guy is likely vomiting in the corner. In Dostoevsky's version, Daisy would be in the late stages of tuberculosis. Her family would be impoverished because Daisy's father has stolen the last of their money to get drunk. and the pile of shirts into which she weeps is soaked in blood from Gatsby's gruesome and recently completed double murder. So yes, the scene would be slightly different in Dostoevsky's hands. Dostoevsky is also a very political writer, and in much of his nonfiction, an angry and sadly at times bigoted writer. After his early radicalism, he became a strong defender of Russian Orthodoxy and enjoyed satirizing the radical intelligentsia of his day. But at least in some cases, his appeal is probably in spite of, rather than because of, his politics. That appeal is explained well by David Foster Wallace, who wrote in 1996, "The thrust here is that Dostoevsky wrote fiction about the stuff that's really important. He wrote fiction about identity, moral value, death, will, sexual versus spiritual love, greed, freedom, obsession, reason, faith, suicide. And he did it without ever reducing his characters to mouthpieces or his books to tracts. His concern was always what it is to be a human being. That is, how to be an actual person, someone whose life is informed by values and principles, instead of just an especially shrewd kind of self-preserving animal." We might simplify the appeal further. Dostoevsky is interested in the capital B big questions. Does God exist? What is man's ultimate purpose? Why does a supposedly loving God permit evil? And it's this last question that is relevant for our discussion tonight, the notion of theodicy, the outcry of humans everywhere and for all ages. How could a just God let this happen? It is no doubt a question we have at least considered in these dark and anxious times. I don't have the theology or the smarts or the time to give you even a decent answer to that big question tonight. But I can point you to a writer for whom the question and the problem of evil in the world was so powerful that it animated some of the best fiction on the planet. The Brothers Karamazov was Dostoevsky's final novel. It was published serially in the Russian Messenger, with the last installment coming in November of 1880, 3 months before the writer's death. It is the story of Fyodor Karamazov and his 4 sons. Now, the really short version of the novel, if there can be one, is this. Someone kills old Fyodor, who's really a pretty bad guy, and the rest of the novel is, in part, a quest to figure out who did it. If you haven't read it, it's certainly worth the investment, and with what could be a very quiet summer ahead, now seems like a good time to dive in. But for our purposes, one scene early in the novel is worth addressing. The scene takes place in a tavern. One brother, Ivan, an intellectual and a skeptic, lectures his younger brother, Alyosha, a monk in training, about the cruelties inflicted on children and how these cruelties compel Ivan to reject the Christian notion of universal harmony. He tells Alyosha, quote, "If the suffering of children goes to make up the sum of suffering needed to buy truth, then I assert beforehand that the whole of truth is not worth such a price." This is always a tough read, this chapter, not because the language is obscure or the subject matter dense. It's all too clear. As his older brother goes on, we can't help feeling for Alyosha. Why doesn't he fight back? Why doesn't he walk out? Poor, meek Alyosha says little as his older brother describes in detail horrible acts of cruelty done to innocent children. If you don't think it sounds like a fun read, you're right, it's not. When I've taught the novel, or this section of the novel, my students invariably come in the next day after having read this chapter, and they say, what was that all about? And I can't help feeling the same way. What's the deal, Dostoevsky? Why so dark? Why do we need multiple examples of children being forced to eat excrement or fiendishly cruel adults committing atrocities? But the brutality depicted by Ivan is the point. The world, as Dostoevsky well knew from his own experiences, could be cruel, wildly unfair, and terrifying. But what has always struck me about this scene is that even as he details the many acts of cruelty perpetrated on children, and even as he cynically and systematically attacks Alyosha's Christian faith, Ivan exhibits what I can only describe as a brilliant love of life. Ivan's not whining or wallowing. He's not blaming the government or the class differences of Imperial Russia. He's not rejecting the status quo for the sake of rebellion to enhance his own image. He is in love with life, and he needs to question the absurdity of it. The question posed by Ivan here, as well as the indictment of God in the following chapter, the famous Grand Inquisitor scene, resonates throughout the novel. At this point in his life, Dostoevsky was a devout believer, but he was also a world-class doubter. What makes his best novels great is that he takes both sides, that of the believer and the skeptic, so honestly and so well. By the end of the novel, despite Alyosha's powerful spiritual journey, Ivan's question still lingers for the reader. Why must children suffer for the sake of universal harmony? How can a just God allow this? Which brings us to the speech at the stone. Fyodor Karamazov is dead. His son Dmitri has been wrongly convicted of his murder, and Ivan is gravely ill. It does not look like a happy ending. Alyosha has befriended a group of young boys, and one of these boys, named Ilyusha, has fallen ill and died. At the end of the novel, they have just celebrated Ilyusha's funeral, and Alyosha Karamazov asks the boys to gather around him. He is moved to speak, surely moved by the tragic destruction of his family, but also moved by the love and the innocence of these young boys. Here is what he says in that speech. Gentlemen, I should like to have a word with you here on this very spot. The boys gathered around him and turned to him at once with attentive, expectant eyes. Gentlemen, we shall be parting soon. Right now, I shall be with my two brothers for a while, one of whom is going into exile and the other is lying near death. But soon I shall leave this town, and perhaps for a very long time. And so we shall part, gentlemen. Let us agree here by Ilyusha's stone that we will never forget, first Ilyusheka and second, one another. And whatever may happen to us later in life, even if we do not meet for 20 years afterwards, let us always remember how we buried the poor boy whom we once threw stones at, remember there by the little bridge, and whom afterwards we all came to love so much. He was a nice boy, a kind and brave boy. He felt honor, and his father's bitter offense made him rise up. And so first of all, let us remember him, gentlemen, all our lives. And even though we may be involved with the most important affairs, achieve distinction, or fall into some great misfortune, all the same, let us never forget how good we once felt here. All together, united by such good and kind feelings, as made us too, for the time that we loved the poor boy, perhaps better than we actually are. My little doves, let me call you that. Little doves, because you are very much like those pretty gray blue birds now at this moment as I look at your kind, dear faces. My dear children, perhaps you will not understand what I'm going to say to you, because I often speak very incomprehensibly. But still you will remember, and someday agree with my words. You must know that there is nothing higher, or stronger, or sounder, or more useful afterwards in life than some good memory, especially a memory from childhood, from the parental home. You hear a lot said about your education, yet some such beautiful, sacred memory, preserved from childhood, is perhaps the best education. If a man stores up many such memories to take into life, then he is saved for his whole life. And even if only one good memory remains with us in our hearts, that alone may serve someday for our salvation. Perhaps we will even become wicked later on. We'll even be unable to resist a bad action. We'll laugh at people's tears and at those who say, as Coley exclaimed today, I want to suffer for all people. Perhaps we will scoff wickedly at such people. And yet, no matter how wicked we may be, and God preserve us from it, as soon as we remember how we buried Ilyusha, how we loved him in his last days, and how we've been talking just now, so much as friends, so together by this stone, the most cruel and jeering man among us, if we should become so, will still not dare laugh within himself at how kind and good he was at this present moment. Moreover, perhaps just this memory alone will keep him from great evil, and he will think better of it and say, yes, I was kind, brave, and honest then. Let him laugh to himself. It's no matter. A man often laughs at what is kind and good. It just comes from thoughtlessness. But I assure you, gentlemen, that as soon as he laughs, he will say at once in his heart, no, it's a bad thing for me to laugh, because one should not laugh at that. One reason that the speech at the stone has meaning for me is that for the last 12 years, I've read this passage on the last day of class to my seniors, as some of you may remember. I offer no comment on it. I offer no analysis. I just read it aloud, hand each student a copy, and send him on his way. It's meant to be a small parting gift, a reminder that literature can offer some solace from the inevitable difficulties and heartache of the adult world. But the nature of this solace may not be readily apparent. Years ago, I had the chance to take a summer course on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. During our discussion, one of my classmates was noticeably angry about this ending to the novel. I can remember him actually standing up and challenging the professor. He said, "This is supposed to be an answer to Ivan's question? This answer stinks. I don't buy it. What a waste." He slammed the book shut, folded his arms for the rest of the class. You can see why he might have been upset, though. In some sense, Alyosha's answer isn't an answer at all, and it's certainly not based on reason. Ivan yearns for a rational answer to the question of why evil exists. So did my classmate who slammed his book shut. So do we all. But ending this very dark novel on this very uplifting note is more, I think, than an attempt to reject the question. Dostoevsky seems to assert that Ivan is asking the wrong questions. This might remind us of the wonderful scene in another of Dostoevsky's novels, Crime and Punishment. As many of you may remember from that novel, Raskolnikov, the protagonist / murderer, has gone to Sonia, the prostitute / Christ figure, to both confess and justify his crime. He torments Sonia by asking her to choose, hypothetically, whether it's right for the despicable illusion or her own family to die. Raskolnikov, like Ivan Karamazov, is both driven and tormented by his own reason. He believes that, quote, man has it all in his hands, and now is the kingdom of reason and light. But his reliance on reason alone has led Raskolnikov to a disastrous crime, psychological decay, and spiritual bankruptcy. When he asks Sonia to choose death for either her tormentor or her family, he cuts through all his rationalizing by asking simply, why such empty questions? Why such empty questions? Dostoevsky seems to be saying the same thing to his readers at the end of The Brothers Karamazov. For Alyosha, a young man who has seen his father murdered, one brother exiled, the other gone mad, it would be easy to ask God why. It would be easy for Alyosha to scream to the heavens about the injustice of it all. But instead, he chooses to pose another question. What do we do now? How then shall we live? And the answer he gives in the speech at the stone is simple but powerful. Drawing on the sacred memories of our youth, we might find the resolve to resist evil and do good. We might recall a time when we were young, when we felt such good and kind feelings for those we loved, that we can be brave and honest and kind. As Alyosha says, if we have many of these memories, we might be saved for our whole lives. In this way, Ilyusha's death becomes not a meaningless tragedy, but a powerful catalyst for love, for kindness, for good and purposeful life. And who among us cannot find at least one such sustaining, and powerful memory. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and listening tonight. And at this time, I'm happy to open up the discussion to questions, comments, any thoughts you might have. We certainly welcome them.
Chris, thanks very much. And I would suggest that everybody, if you want to chime in on an experience that you've had with this lecture or with Dostoevsky or in general, if you want to share any comments now, you can unmute yourself and chime in.
I'm happy to come in with a question here for Mr. Lynch. This passage is kind of tough, I think, to look at when you're older, because it's saying to me, like, damn, I wish I had a few more memories from my childhood. Like, I wish someone read this passage to me when I was 6 or 7. So what do you do philosophically now if you're past that age where you're forming these important memories? What do I do as someone who's older? I'm still young, but if I'm at this point in my life, like, how should I take Dostoevsky?
You don't count as older, JP. That's a great question, though. It's funny. I think largely what that passage is about is understanding that there are those like really sacred moments from your childhood, and I'm sure that if you do some digging, you're definitely gonna find those. I share it with you guys, seniors in high school, because I feel like that's an interesting point to be looking back on those 18 years and figuring out what those sacred moments are. It's interesting, going off your question a little bit. It's an ironic moment for the character Alyosha. He had a crummy childhood. His father, who was a mess, abandoned him really young. His mom died, and he has obviously this mess of a family life. So it's interesting that he talks about the childhood home, the sacredness of the childhood home and preserving that. I also think it's interesting considering Dostoevsky's own life too. His mother died when he was really young. His dad died when he was a teenager. His dad was murdered, we think. And he did not have a happy childhood by any means. But for him, that idea, the sacredness of the childhood home and the family, that's an education. I think it makes us look at our own childhood with a great deal of gratitude, I hope.
Thanks, JP. I do have a question from the field, let's put it that way. And comparing the wordiness and the length of Dickens and Dostoevsky, and great lessons to be learned from both authors, but digging deep through enormous books was the gist of the question. What would you share on that topic?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's funny. I think whenever we're teaching one of these 19th century novels that was published serially, it's always funny, and maybe it was something like Tale of Two Cities where it first hit some of you guys, but you find out, wait a minute, Dickens was being paid by the word. That's why he wrote. This would have been a lot shorter if he didn't need to submit another installment next month. I always think that's kind of interesting, but I also think for some of these writers that publish these novels serially, these long novels, it actually was sort of it imposed a form on them that I think enhanced their creativity. So that the some of what we think of like these long, dense novels, well, part of it was, hey, this installment needs to be in for publication at this time next month. How do I shape the story in a way where it's going to take me to the next installment? The other thing I'd say, I always say this about Crime and Punishment. That's a 550-page novel, and it takes place in just 9 days. It's intense 9 days of time. But Dostoevsky says that he actually wrote the whole novel. He wrote Crime and Punishment in the first person, the story of a murder from a murderer's perspective. And then he threw it in the fire. I think I've told my students that before. So, if he's a guy who's just worried about being paid by the word, he would have published the first version. Instead, he really felt like he didn't tell the story the way he wanted to. So he throws, a finished draft of this novel in the fire and starts again. So I think if we're concerned about the 19th century novel and some of its wordiness and guilty as charged for some of those writers, I think there's good reason for their length and complexity.
Thanks, Chris. We do have a question from Anthony Perez. If you'd want to unmute yourself, Anthony, and step to the mic.
Hi, Mr. Lynch. Thanks for doing this tonight. So I guess my question is sort of getting a little nitpicky. So Dostoevsky's answer to the question is using childhood memories to, anchor yourself in a way later in life. But I guess to just sort of, try and understand that better, it might be worthwhile asking why specifically childhood memories? Because it does seem that later in life is when we typically get, those memories that tend to really stand out as defining moments in our lives.
Yeah.
Marriage, childbirth, or, the birth of one's child, and, actually having friendships that, because they have withstood the test of time, are self-evidently strong and therefore more meaningful. So why childhood?
That's a great question, AP, and thanks for joining. So I think for Dostoevsky, childhood was really important. As I said, he didn't have a great childhood. He also he had 4 children, but he lost 2 of them at a young age, as often happened in the 19th century. But in a lot of his work, there's this desperate attachment to the innocence of children. You can remember in Crime and Punishment, Sonia's little sister Polechka is this beautiful 10-year-old girl who, she doesn't play a big part in the novel, but her depiction is absolutely perfect as being that great age between understanding and not quite understanding. And he does that in other works as well. And I guess to answer your question, that may be why childhood is the important place for him, where those memories are generated, because there are so many wonderful moments that are uncorrupted, innocent, just movements from not understanding to understanding. And certainly as you get older, as you get farther away from childhood, you get farther away from those, what I call sacred memories. And I think it's really important to return to those and to be present to those. I know for Dostoevsky it really was.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Anthony. And now we're going to hear from Joe, if you want to unmute and join.
Hey, is this on?
You're good, Joe.
Oh, awesome. Mr. Lynch, thanks for doing this. This is a throwback to AP Lit.
My pleasure.
So I was thinking, you know me more as a Tolstoy fan than a Dostoevsky fan, but I was thinking, trying to compare the two, and my consensus came up with the fact that Tolstoy, you're trying to get in their mind and understand what's going on in their mind, whereas with Dostoevsky, it seems more that you're already in their mind and you're trying to figure out the why. And what I'm trying to understand here is that from this passage, it seems that we're trying to get more of a worldly understanding from the firsthand experience of the character, whereas in other Russian literature like Tolstoy, it's more of an interpretation of what's happening rather than a description, kind of like here in this passage is saying, well, essentially appreciate the things in life. So I'm just kind of wondering, why do we have such stark differences in different Russian literature pieces? If I said that clearly enough.
Chris, I think you need to unmute. Did we lose you? Hold on, I just got a text from him. Let me. Okay, he should be joining the meeting again. Just if we could bear with us 1 second. There was some question, Joe. He hung up.
Mr. O'Malley, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I got it. Don't worry. I'll remember that one, JP. Let's see if we get him coming up.
I scared him away.
Hey, Mike, I'm back.
Okay, great, Chris.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I'm on my phone now.
Did you hear the question?
I heard most of Joe's question. Was it Joe's question?
Yeah. Joe, right.
I think
tried to answer it for you, but I thought I'd let you go.
I'm here. I'm ready. I love that you're thinking about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and comparing the two. I think for me the key difference, particularly with this passage, Tolstoy doesn't have many characters, or I don't know if he has any characters quite like Alyosha. These really like simple, pure characters. Dostoevsky has a bunch of them in his novels. He tries to find like these sacred, innocent characters. Tolstoy's characters are more worldly, maybe because he was more worldly. You know, he was, as you know from reading about him, he lived quite a kind of rich, lavish lifestyle, whereas Dostoevsky, for most of his life, was scraping to get by. He was generally poor. He was generally in the city. Even when he had success with his writing, he was always sort of still just grabbing at it, still not quite there. Whereas Tolstoy just was more worldly, I think. And really, Tolstoy didn't have as much interest in that innocent character. If he did, it was through the peasantry. Tolstoy's only real, like, pure innocent characters are the Russian peasants.
All right, Joe, thanks very much. We're going to call on another great Russian, Dmitry Duhovskoy, who's going to chime in. If you want to unmute yourself and fire away.
Hey, Mr. Lynch, thanks for doing this.
Dmitry, how are you, buddy?
Good, how are you? Thanks so much for doing this. This is really powerful. I think it's amazing to reread this at a later age, especially considering creating those memories in youth and having that responsibility. But my question to you is, how has your reading of Dostoevsky changed over the last 15 years? And maybe what scenes or characters have become more or less impressive to you over time as you've reread it and experienced and gotten older and had different experiences yourself?
Wow, what a great question, Dmitry. And by the way, if you're looking for an awesome Russian beard, look at Dmitry's. That's what Dostoevsky would be jealous of, that beard. That is good stuff. That's a great question because I think one of the best things about this job is getting to read these great writers over and over and every year, and believe me, it does change. So I taught this novel to you in like 2004, 2005. And at that point, I didn't have any children. My life circumstances were very different. And so, as you have kids and as your life changes, you approach everything a little bit differently. I'd say one big one for me is sort of the sympathy that I have for certain Dostoevskian characters. I sort of joked about, in comparing to Great Gatsby, that a lot of these characters are a mess. They have tuberculosis. This guy's a drunk. This guy's this. And I think the more I read Crime and Punishment, for example, and Marmeladov, this terrible drunk who, because of his inability to get sober, his daughter has to go into prostitution. I think at one point I might have condemned him, but I realized Dostoevsky's writing about him with a great deal of sympathy. This is a tremendously sad character, really a noble character. And I'd say if there's anything I notice in all of his works, it's that he treats his characters, even the least among them, with such sympathy and I guess I'd call it like kindness and love. That's been something that sort of changed for me in my reading of the novels over the time.
Thanks, Dimitri. We would like to hear next from Thayer Wade. Thayer, if you want to join us.
Hi, Mr. Lynch. Thanks so much for that. That was absolutely terrific. I'm curious to, how you doing? I'm curious to hear what you think of the end of the speech with laughter. There seems to be a tension to me, when you think back about, when you harken in kind of, childhood memories, and, I think the point is that those are going to be, I think his words are your salvation. When you laugh with those memories, that's, a child's laughter is pure joy. It's innocent. Whereas what we see here, he seems to be seeing laughter as more kind of cynical. I'm better than that. I know better. I'm kind of curious if I'm looking at this right, or what you make of that potential tension.
I think that's a great question there. I think in this scene and in this speech, there's this beautiful, almost like syrupy sweet sort of connection between the character Alyosha and these young boys. So I think that the laughter is really like, it's like kids' birthday party laughter. And I know they just come from a funeral, so that's a weird thing to say, but it's like this emotional outburst by these young kids who have gone through some stuff that's kind of difficult, and Alyosha's sort of enjoying that with them. Some of it, and I love the part of the speech where he's referencing that they kind of make fun of each other too. Like the guy Kolya is really ambitious and says he's going to do all these great things, and they make fun of him. But it certainly reminds me of St. Sebastian's. Like there's this wonderful sort of ribbing that goes on, and I think that's a big. I think Dostoevsky's aware of that. The other thing I'd say, and I think your question is such a good one. I'd refer you to your one of your classmates, soon to be Father Michael Petro, wrote an essay a long time ago about, I can't forget it. It was about laughter and Crime and Punishment. And he literally went through the whole novel and looked at every instance of laughter, sardonic laughter, joyful laughter. And I had never noticed it before, but he was able to point out that Dostoevsky uses, I don't know how many he identified, a number of different forms of laughter in the novel. And you wouldn't necessarily think that, because these novels are generally about sort of dark subject matter, but there's laughter, on every page.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thayer.
Thanks, Thayer. We have a few more questions still coming through. Chris, plenty to talk about. Cam Rivera, would you like to step forward?
Hey, Mr. Lynch. Thanks for
Cam.
tonight's lecture. I have a question in regards to how we're supposed to approach Dostoevsky's personal life influence in his work. I know from one angle, he had a son who died during the writing of this novel. So even if you look at his other texts, like The Underground Man, we're very tempted to kind of accredit a lot of his ideas to maybe his own personal experiences. But at the same time, knowing that he's Christian, knowing that he's part of the Russian Orthodox, he seems to fight for and against Christianity, therefore kind of removing his own bias and letting the reader come to his own conclusions. So when we go towards when any of us here are approaching a new author, not necessarily another Dostoevsky novel, how should we approach the author's influence to the novel? Should we consider that as maybe some of the motivation to their thinking, or should we assume that the authors are removing themselves from their work?
I think that's great. I think that's a great question, Cam. And it's one you have to I think, deal with. It's not something you can ignore. I'll say this: the way I approach every text is I tend to be text first. So, whatever biographical stuff or whatever background stuff's going on in that author's life at that time, if I start reading that into the novel, I'm not giving the novel the attention it deserves. And I think it's dangerous to start making those connections, right? We do that maybe more than anyone. We do that with Shakespeare. What little we know about his life, we try to pull every little thing out of his life and find it in his plays. And I think sometimes that's an injustice to the works themselves. I will say Dostoevsky, maybe more than most writers, for me, his life story is so interesting. And there's a 5-volume biography by a guy named Joseph Frank that is just such a good read. And I know it doesn't sound like something you're going to go pick up right now, but it's just so fascinating to look at where he was, his great struggles early in life, and everything he faced along the way. If there's a case for biographical criticism, I think this Joseph Frank biography is about as good as it gets, because it does do a good job of it does a good job doing what I'm cautioning against, which is linking the life to the work. It does it in a respectful way, a way that still sort of puts the text first rather than sort of making the text the slave to the biography.
All right, Cam, thanks for joining in. Chris, more questions coming. I'll call on James Ryan. James, are you available?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Lynch.
Hi, Jimmy.
How's it going?
Great.
So you mentioned Alyosha talking with his brother in the tavern, that great Grand Inquisitor scene, and how he kind of had no answers at that time and wanted to, or it seems that he's been struggling with these things from that early point in the novel to this later point. How much is this speech representative of his own growth and how he himself is looking back on his own childhood? Like you mentioned, he has this really rough family life. So how much is he like believing in these words for himself and advocating this for these kids to kind of build these memories? Or is this an example of Dostoevsky just reaching beyond the character to try to advise his readers to do something?
That's a great question, Jimmy. I do think it's true. I don't think it's the last thing. I don't think it's Dostoevsky just using Alyosha as a mouthpiece. Not that you said that, but I think that this is very true to Alyosha's character and his kind of growth at this point. He's also, he's gone through a lot in that his spiritual mentor, Father Zosima, who is the elder Zosima, has died, and that was maybe more of a loss of a father than his real father. But I think we can read the scene as Alyosha's grown-up moment, as his moment to look at these younger kids in front of him and offer some sort of wisdom, which he hasn't done a lot in the novel. He's the younger brother. He's the youngest of the three. He's the most naive, the most innocent, and he's kind of, you know this from your own family. The youngest sort of watches a lot and observes, and it's a time for Alyosha to actually sort of, I guess, take the lead at the end of the novel, and it seems to me to be true to what his character has become. I should say, I'm sure I mentioned this to you guys before, but Dostoevsky had actually thought about a sequel to The Brothers Karamazov. He did it with Crime and Punishment too. Like, there's something coming next, and he had outlined like Alyosha's journey. He never got to it with Crime and Punishment, and he died after The Brothers Karamazov, so he didn't get to it there either. But we'll never know what became of poor Alyosha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. We'll call on next Pat McGowan, if you're still there, Pat.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you, Mr. Lynch. Really appreciate you doing this.
Hi, Patrick.
So I wanted to know what your thoughts were on any potential images of Christianity in this passage, with the idea, like you mentioned in the beginning, that Dostoevsky is kind of looking for some of these answers from God. And I think he kind of throws some key words in there, like suffering and eternal and salvation. I just want to let you know, if you thought that was kind of a stretch, or that's just kind of him kind of playing into some of his own thoughts.
No, I think you're right on there. Yeah, I mean, I think, that Dostoevsky can be kind of like heavy-handed with the Christian imagery. That might be our only criticism, not our only, that's a criticism of him, is that sometimes it's like, all right, we get it. You're a Christian writer. I think he strikes a good balance in this passage, that it's really a human passage. But for Dostoevsky, the Christian experience was a human experience. He certainly didn't separate the two. It was essential to who he was as a writer and a person. And I think the thing about his novels and that, Christian symbolism, or I don't know how to say it, like a overly Christian ending, that happens in Crime and Punishment. It sort of happens in another novel, The Idiot, as well. But I think here he found a good balance, that it doesn't turn into a sermon, even though it is the speech at the stone. It's like a genuine expression of a young guy at a moment of sorrow and angst, trying to be hopeful.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to hear next from Dan Fulham. Are still coming.
Cool. I just wanted to provide some commentary on, and ultimately hear your response to Mr. Lynch on, I think, what is, for me, was when I first read this passage, and I think for a lot of people that we've already discussed so far, there's a lot of dissatisfaction, I think, with, all right, this has been a novel about like the abject horror and sinfulness of the human race, and the answer is like, remember some nice Christmas morning or something I had when I was 6. And I think that can feel like inherently unsatisfying. But I think what's really important and critical to remember in the passage is that when Alyosha's giving this speech, he's not 6, he's past the age of 18. And I think he is clearly and emphatically having one of those simple moments just steeped in love somehow. And I think the reason a memory from childhood is picked in this context is because childhood is inherently uncomplicated. There's not these like rationalizing after the fact beliefs about how to confront the evil in life. So I think his answer, Alyosha's answer, isn't so much remember some nice thing that happened when you were 5, but it is, despite the fact that he's heard a dissertation on the fact that children have and always will suffer from Ivan, despite the fact that religion's been stripped down to him, despite all the horrible things that have occurred in the novel, he's still taking a highly human, in this case Christian, and I think totally punk rock decision to just simply love a kid that died, even though it makes it hurt more. I just think it's just a really strong declaration of the fact that life's difficult, it's hard, we're unsure what context we're in, but you better above all be kind. He says, first all, be kind in the following passage to all the kids after. And I think it's easy to get lost in the weeds of just focusing on childhood memory there. And that's my, involved rant here, but I'm curious to hear your response to that.
I missed these rants. It's good to hear that one. That was well done. I think that's a great point. And I think you're right on. I think the speech is meant to contrast with Ivan's high-mindedness, and again, it connects with other Dostoevsky's work where, the reason, the abstract, all these things that are so important, life's questions, why does God permit evil? No. Be kind. See that guy over there? Be kind to him right over there. And let's start there. I keep going back to Crime and Punishment, and I've read it with many of you. I just think that moment of the raising of Lazarus when Sonia reads it to Raskolnikov, and he's all worried about universal harmony too. He's like Ivan, like, okay, my job is to murder, this woman so that I can serve universal peace and universal harmony. And in the raising of Lazarus, Jesus says, I am the way, I am the life and the truth, and it's like, oh, no, I don't need to serve universal harmony. I need to serve that guy over there. And so I think Dostoevsky is absolutely in this scene, Dan. I think he's bringing us back to what's most essential, which is not theory, but kindness in practice.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we still have some more questions. Let me just get them lined up here. So I have a question coming in from CJ Sanasuaso. CJ, are you ready to roll?
I am. Hey, Mr. Lynch.
Hey, CJ.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
In this novel, Dostoevsky kind of uses a narrator as a device, where I think he sometimes refers to himself in like the first person, using I, and that narrator kind of morphs into the characters that the narrator is narrating for. So my first part of the question is, what do you make of that device? Because sometimes it's hard to follow if the narrator is a character, if it's Dostoevsky himself. And the second part, what do you make of the fact that the beginning parts of the book are so heavy in the narrator providing like background, and then Dostoevsky chooses to end the book with this pretty simple imagery with the narrator kind of nowhere to be found, letting the characters kind of bring us to the finish line there?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great observation, CJ. I think I haven't quite wrapped my head around it, because I think the beginning of this novel is really tough. It's a slog, as you said, because it's like it's narrator heavy, and then that narrator's voice really disappears at parts of the novel, and then there are these long stretches where you have the trial, where you have the lawyers speaking. The phrase there, the term that's been used to describe Dostoevsky's style, as you may know, is polyphonic, many-voiced. And so I think that's some of what's going on, is that Dostoevsky was aware of kind of the godly narrator voice imposing his will on the novel. And in part, he rejected that. In part, he decided that that many-voiced novel was more authentic, more real in a lot of ways. Tolstoy is like the ultimate example of that as a narrator that will not relinquish control. Tolstoy has got a strangle. He's got that narrative in a headlock, and he's just pounding away for thousands of pages. Whereas Dostoevsky, he seems to turn it over sometimes to his characters, which I think it's one of his strengths. I'm quoting somebody else here. I can't remember who said this about him. I've been Belinsky, but don't quote me on that. He said that Dostoevsky wrote novel tragedies, and that it was wiser to compare him to Shakespeare than to other novelists, because, like Shakespeare, he let his characters run away with the narrative sometimes. So I think that's some of what's going on.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, CJ. Matt Butler, if you're ready, fire away.
Hi, Mr. Lynch. Thanks for doing
Matthew. How are you, buddy?
Good. I wanted to get your reaction just a little bit more. I think Dan pointed this out 2 questions ago. But that sentence where he says, let us be kind and then honest and then never forget one another. How do you read that? Like, why on a second is he going to name a third thing and pivots direction? And then to make it seem like he did it intentionally, he says, I say it again. I give you my word. Like, I wondered, how do you read that pivot and transition in the sentence?
I lost you for 1 second. Can you just give me the sentence one more time?
It's second line of the second full paragraph, second of 775. So that sentence that Dan flagged, right, where he says, before all be kind, then honest, and then M dash, let us never forget. There's sort of like this pivot. I didn't know how to read that sentence, and I didn't know if he was ad-libbing or why you think honest comes second. Also, I like that suggests like sometimes, maybe a white lie is the right path. So I just wondered how you read that.
Yeah, that's a great pickup. You're right, because kind of like the flow of the passage, I get the sense that it's a little bit of Alyosha getting carried away with himself, that he's and it's meant to have that kind of like naive sound and feel to it, that he's not totally comfortable. He's not totally in command with his lecture for these young boys. He's winging it a little bit. It's done largely with feeling, and so that's kind of the way I read that line, is that he's getting a little carried away.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Chris, I have got a question from Chris Riley, but he does not have access to a microphone, so I'll ask it on his behalf.
Sure.
So first he says thanks, and he's been thinking a lot about cover art and the ways that authors collaborate with artists so that the cover acts as a window into their work. As far as he knows, Dostoevsky didn't do that, but if you were Dostoevsky, what would you want your Brothers Karamazov cover to look like?
Interesting question, Christopher. That's a great question. I feel like we've had this conversation before. I don't know. I don't know. I think I've been in recent years kind of collecting versions of Crime and Punishment and Brothers Karamazov to look at the different art. I will say this: they're all very extreme, and I challenge you to find a Dostoevsky novel with like a sun on the front or like a smiley face. You're not going to find that. I like this cover a lot. Sorry, you can't really see this very well, but it looks like a Rothko painting, although it's not a Rothko painting. It's sort of just bright red, blood red kind of image. The other one I really like is the old Crime and Punishment one, which is the big Russian cross that sort of covers the whole novel. It's not very subtle, but it points to the not so subtle ending of that novel.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Next up is Billy McCarthy. Billy, you with us?
Yeah, I'm here. You hear me?
Hey, Bill.
Hey. So my question is, without having read this novel in full, I see at the center of the scene, one person coming to terms with what he thinks really matters in life, with all of that happening in the face of a tragedy. I guess my question is, what do you think Dostoevsky would say to all of us as, is a one universal lesson that we can take as we collectively face an international tragedy in the form of the coronavirus?
Yeah, great question. Big question, Bill. I thought some about this because Dostoevsky really was like an end of the world kind of imagination. He thought about this stuff a lot, like the way the world would end, the final judgment. That wasn't just kind of far off in the future for him. Like that occupied his mind space a lot, I think. And I'm certainly not saying it's the end of the world. I'm hoping it's not the end of the world. But for him, I think because he took it so seriously, because he had those thoughts, he always needed to come back to the most essential, basic form of kindness and salvation for him. That like there was always an hour to be saved. Even his like darkest characters, I think, he can't turn them into pure evil. He always has them like this moment at which they can find redemption. I'm not really answering your question well, but the other sort of odd one that I thought of was there's a scene in Crime and Punishment. It was mentioned in an article I read recently. I think Mr. Cornish shared it with me. But there's a scene where Raskolnikov is in prison in Siberia, and he has a dream about a pestilence coming from somewhere in Asia and sweeping across the world and sort of and being the end of the world and civilization as we know it. And it came up, and I hadn't thought of it, but when I saw that, I thought, oh man, Dostoevsky, he got the 20th century right. He predicted Stalinism, totalitarianism, essentially. And apparently he may be getting the 21st century right. So I guess the answer, Bill, is we got to go back and read him some more and figure out what's coming next.
Thank you.
Well, Chris, it appears that we've finished up the questions. You're welcome to sign off with some parting remarks. I want to thank you so much for making this lecture and this seminar available. I'll put it out one more time to anybody if they'd like to step forward and share a last question or comment. And then I'll pass it to you, Chris, to sign off.
Sure. I think I'm unmuted now, Mike.
You're ready to go, Bill.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Chris. That was awesome. I was privileged to work with Chris from day one when he joined us, and we team taught a freshman writing class together. And I knew that we had someone who was just a very gifted person with a great mind and a huge heart. And he only gets better and better. And it's been so wonderful to see so many faces of people I love. Matt Butler, I'm looking at you now. I remember freshman writing with you. And Billy McCarthy, we spent some time together in Duke. And all you guys, it's just wonderful to see you. We love you so much. We care about you. We choose to believe that it's just a new beginning in this world and not the end. So that's where I'm coming from, guys. And it's a great opportunity for all of us to grow. It's a time, times of great crisis are great birth opportunities for great leadership. And that's what you guys are made of. And Chris, it was just wonderful. And I think just one comment I'd like to make is so much of that scene and those words are about choosing to remember and anchoring themselves on the stone. And this boy who had so many good qualities that as long as he lived his life pure and good, maybe if we remember this stone, remember this time together, you know, we're going to be more prompted by the Holy Spirit ourselves to be kind and do the next right thing. So thank you all. God bless.
Thanks very much, Bill. And Chris, if you want to close us out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Mike. I mean, obviously, the opportunity to do something like this is just fantastic. And I've been so blessed to be part of this community for a long time. And I hope I'm a part of it for a lot longer. I think as a St. Sebastian's community, we are well heeled and well prepared for whatever's coming next. We're so blessed to have so many great alums, so many parents of alums, and so many current parents that make this place what it is. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining me. Please, if you have questions or thoughts, I love hearing from all of our alums. So great to see your faces. God bless you, and God bless your families. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again.
Thanks, Chris.
We'll see you
Thanks,
again.
Chris. Thank you.
Thank you so much.